listening to What in the World, brought to you by Great World Productions. I'm your host, Isaac Hedges, joined once again by co-host Jacob Fulmer. Jake, what in the world are we looking at tonight?
Well, tonight we are going to be continuing the section on philosophy and big ideas. And so, of course, we started this last week, and now here on the second week of March, we are going to continue it. And also, just before we get into those next couple of questions, just a quick reminder that 2 nights from now, we will have the conclusion of our Friday the 13th special. So, part two of Friday the 13th special will be premiering in 2 days, this coming Friday, March 13th at 9 p.m. So you'll want to stay tuned for the next episode here of the Great World Podcast. But now that we have looked into that, we'll go ahead and we'll look at our first question here today on What in the World. And that is this question 3. Why does time feel faster as we age? I guess I'll go ahead and kind of get us started on this question. And I would certainly say that it does. I think anybody who has gone through at least 15, 16 years of their life could probably agree that time does feel faster as we continue to get older and everything regarding that. And I would say one reason why that is the case is because our lives, you could say, get busier. Or it could also be, I would say, another reason is because we have a better understanding of the concept of time. So, what are your thoughts
Naturally.
on it?
Yes, naturally, Jake, I would agree with you on that. I would say, in large part, and yes, naturally, I do agree with the statement generally that time does feel faster, seem to go faster as we age. And I'd say, in large part, the reason for that is we simply have a broader scope. We've got more of a point of reference for that in terms of how long different things take, the significance of years, certainly speaking more in the long term. I mean, think about certainly for many of the folks out there seems to be common experience. Of course, naturally, as touched just a couple of years ago, may seem like ages ago, may have seemed like something ancient, and now a couple of years for us perhaps doesn't seem like such a long time.
Yeah, I think so. And I guess kind of expanding on this point about why does time feel faster as we age, I think part of it also has to do with I think it could have to do with there's a little bit less stress involved as we go later on in life. I think kind of in the first 30 years of a person's life, they're very stressed out about kind of transitioning into the world. At first, you are growing up as a child and you're uncertain about what your adulthood is going to look like. Then you start getting closer to adulthood and into the first few years of adulthood, and you're still trying to establish who you are as a person. And so that can seem very time consuming. It can seem like it takes a while to get involved in your career, to really build your career. And so I think that really has to do a lot with it. So there's a lot more stress. And anytime that we're stressed as people, we tend to, it tends to feel like that time is going a lot slower. And so I think part of that kind of goes with that it has to do with stress. I think we're more stressed as we're younger, and as we get older, we become, I guess you could say, wiser. And so we don't necessarily stress out as much because we've been in stressful situations. So the stress doesn't affect us very much. And when the stress doesn't affect us very much, that in turn causes us to not feel stressed out, and it makes time feel like it goes a lot faster because we're enjoying things because there's less stress in life.
Right, that certainly makes sense at an older age. It would be more seasoned and things that seemed just hugely consequential at a younger age just a few years ago that now we've got that experience under our belts doesn't seem so significant anymore. And that is aside, of course, from perhaps a more obvious point as to why time might feel faster as we age is because in our earliest years, while certainly growing up in childhood, there seem to be more milestones, and naturally, when you're still growing in different things and learning more and more new things each year. And again, one could say that in adulthood, it can stagnate somewhat and become more boring, as it were. Hopefully, not too terribly boring, but again, in adulthood, there's less change. Again, a person, for years on end, may well be working the same job. Now, how to remedy this? Well, a number of different possibilities there. Now, won't recommend to full-grown adults that they act like a kid. Certainly, that would be a little bit disordered, but naturally, even one can observe this simply by seeing, as we mentioned, of course, in our childhood, we can see that certainly in the upbringing of our own children. So perhaps that is another way to experience things, certainly not by. Um, being that way personally, just as a full grown adult behaving like a child, but rather by having children of your own. And again, many will say, even then, that it goes by fast, but it'll really help to put things into perspective. Again, all of us out there have our own callings, but certainly a worthwhile point on that front. Jake?
Yes, and you mentioned with children who can make you seem like that you're aging faster, not necessarily time. Time seems to go slower, and you seem to be aging more than time is going by. But so I think that also plays a role as any children that you may have as they begin to grow older. There's a little bit less responsibilities, you could say, from when they're a baby or a toddler, and so then time seems to go by a little bit faster because, well, you're not feeding that baby at 2 or 3 in the morning. And so obviously that's going to make time feel like it goes by a lot faster. So that kind of wraps things up on the third question. That takes us into our fourth question, our final question for this weekly edition. What makes something true?
Oh, well, that's a great question, Jake, certainly. And a bit of a difficult one. This isn't a question, certainly in my experience, something that comes up often. It's certainly something that's taken for granted. Again, it's a very rudimentary term, sort of the distinctions between true and false. We learn those very early on. But again, to define this without giving a circular definition, that being a definition that includes the word itself, that doesn't provide an actual definition that can stand on its own 2 feet, as it were, well, it could be easy to get stumped on that. Jake, do you have any thoughts on it?
So I think when we're talking about something that's true, so true as in um, accurate, factual. I would say those are some other words that we could look for. So when we're looking for something that's accurate or factual, I think that's another way that we could break it down. We could replace that word and we could say, what makes something factual? Well, in order for it to be factual, it has to be something that is actually there. I guess we could say, like I could say that a fact is, and this is not actually a real fact. Okay, this is just me exaggerating, but I could say that the Statue of Liberty is 3 miles tall, and we could say that that's a fact. Again, it's not a real fact. That definitely is not true. I know that it's a lot shorter than that. 100%. It's a lot shorter than that. I can guarantee you. But that would be what we would call something that's true, something that's a fact. And so, what makes something true? I would say just the fact that it's there, that information is accurate. But I think it really depends here. This question, I think, could be expanded upon. Of course, these questions have been created by artificial intelligence, so we do have to keep in mind that the intelligence is, well, artificial. But as far as what makes something true, I think it really depends on the context. We could be talking about as far as like what makes people true, what makes a concept true. You could really break it down into many different layers, but overall, I think kind of if we're being general, which I think is what this question is wanting us, I think the question is wanting us to be pretty broad and general and open-ended. Just something that's factual, something that's accurate, something that does exist.
Absolutely, Jake. Certainly, I don't know if you've ever had the opportunity to see it, but again, that Statue of Liberty, if you ever get the opportunity to see it, it's beautiful. And again, beauty being just another one of the transcendentals. So, as you mentioned that, Jake, Um, Certainly worth noting. It seems somewhat paradoxical, and to simply say that just by its present, sort of um, by its own virtue, being there seems like somewhat of a misnomer, somewhat of a circular definition, and yet that is exactly how truth has been defined historically, as certainly with the other transcendentals, the good, the true, and the beautiful. Of course, certainly, as we know, good being substantial, evil, the opposite or the inversion of that, is not substantial, but merely the privation of it, or the absence of good, as is the case. The good, the true, and the beautiful are the substantial. The alternative is not substantial, but merely the inversion of it. So, a great point there, Jake. And I'd say um, hit the nail on the head there with the definition as best we can, anyway.
Yeah, and I guess if we want to get really factual, if we want to talk about something that is true, the actual Statue of Liberty itself is 151 feet, which would be approximately 0.029 miles. If you were to look at the full height, including the ground all the way to the torch, that would be 305 feet, which would be approximately 0.058 miles. So again, obviously I was way off and I was not intending to be accurate. I was intending to over exaggerate. But so that would be something that's not true, what I said earlier. But what is true is the factual information that I listed off. Well, I believe that's all the time that we have for this weekly edition of What in the World.
Absolutely. I believe it is. Well, we thank you all again for tuning in. So, until next time.
I'm Jacob Fulmer.
And I'm Isaac Hedges, host of What in the World. From all of us at What in the World and Great World Productions, good night and God bless.